Good morning folks, and welcome to the workshop of Armitage Lover. Why should you watch my video on making a card holder when there are already any number of videos on the same topic? Because I teach people not just the how, but the why. The why is as important as the how. So rather than just this being a work along video where you watch me do things, I'm going to explain what I'm doing. Why a technique is better here than perhaps something else. You're going to see me do something a different way that you may have seen before. You're going to see techniques that have perhaps been modernized. And I'm going to explain to you why I'm choosing those techniques, why they've been modernized. And if you have an understanding not just on how to apply that technique, but why you're applying it, what you're learning is how you can apply that elsewhere. In addition to that, if you know why you're doing a technique, it is easier to understand how to fix it when it goes wrong. I'm going to make this video the same way that I make all the videos on my Seekers from the Workshop channel. It is not just a how-to. This is a full-on lesson. Don't skip. Don't fast forward. You are going to learn an awful lot of techniques that are applicable elsewhere. In this video, you will learn how to make a template correctly. And we're going to use the modern style using my pre-pricking style of making holes. However, if you struggle with making templates, even after watching this video, you can go to my website, armitagelether.com, the shop, and I'll put a link down below, that way round, and you can download the pack. This is going to cost you £10. However, I'm encouraging you not to do that. I want to teach you how to make the templates properly, because templates are probably the biggest hurdle most leatherworkers face. And if you can get a clear and concise understanding of the stages you have to go through to produce a high quality, viable template, that door opens up to so many other options. This is a foundational piece, without doubt. But even if you are an adept leatherworker, you may struggle with the concept of what you need to include with the template. So whether you're looking at this thinking card holders are not on my horizon, which is absolutely fine, template making may well be. So it's worth watching for that and that alone. If you want to see more videos like this, then obviously a good way of saying that is subscribing. When I'm teaching people that are perhaps early in their journey, I teach a particular style of making. And this style of teaching follows the principles of what job does the item have to do? That job is to hold cards. We can make a decision about how many cards that we want to hold. I'm going to say what would be sensible in this would be 2 cards in each pocket, and this separator in here, we can put some cash in. 4 cards and a bit of cash. Simple as that. So before we move forward, we need to know how big the item that's going in it, because we are working to internal dimensions. So we simply measure the item, and we want the width, the height, and the thickness. 3 dimensions. The thickness is the one everybody leaves off, but we need it. So the width of our item is 85.57. We're going to call that 86. And the lovely thing about this is cards are universal. So it doesn't matter where you are in the world, these dimensions work for you. 53.96. Evidently, we're going to call that 54. And before you start putting comments down below, this is not a real card. Now we want the thickness. This is coming in at 0.77. We're going to call that a millimetre. So now we have an understanding of the size of our card. We now want to find out how big our card holder has to be so it fits our cards. We're going to create what's called a linear measurement, and that is literally we're drawing a line. This line represents the journey the leather travels from one side of the card holder to the other. We are only calculating the width of our card holder. So we're looking at what happens on the journey of our leather. We have the edge of our leather, which is here. The first thing that happens is our stitch line, so we'll write that down. The next thing that happens is the thickness of our item, because the leather has to rise up over the thickness, drop down and carry on. If we don't accommodate that, then we're looking at stretching the leather to get it to fit, and initially that may not be comfortable, so we need to calculate the thickness. Then we want to add some wiggle room, because if we don't, it will be so tight we'll struggle getting it in and out, and we are then expected to get it in and out perfectly straight. Well, we don't. We put it in one side and it wiggles. So we give it a wobble, we give it a push. Giving it some wiggle room, it's not so loose it will come out, but it's loose enough for us to be able to use it functionally. Then we've got the card. Then we've got everything that happened here on the other side. So, what are we talking about when we're talking about our stitch line? I'm going to recommend to you, if you're early days, a 4mm stitch line. The reason for this, if you have a 4mm stitch line, because there are 4 pieces of leather ultimately going to get stitched together. If we are inaccurate with our cutting, with our stitch marking, we will have variation between those 4 pieces of leather. If we produce a 4mm stitch line and we have to sand some of it back, and when we're finished we have a 3mm stitch line, it still looks good. We have somewhere to go. I see an awful lot of people making items like this oversized and then cutting them all as one. Your cutting has to be exceptionally good if you're going to do that, to ensure you finish with a right angle edge. Given there are pockets, so therefore the leather is no longer flat when we cut it, that diminishes that possibility. If your cutting is that good, cut first. But we're going to look at how we do that to ensure we get a consistent edge at the outset. It reduces how much work we have to do to get it right at the end. If we produce a 4mm stitch line and we get everything right, a 4mm stitch line still looks good. So 4mm is a very, very forgiving stitch line at the outset. That's one I'm going to recommend to you. That's one all my students have when they come here. Yes, absolutely. As you become adept, we can change the stitch line, we can change the SPI. There's an awful lot of reasons behind why we would choose a different one. But for the common outset, 4 is a really good number. We are also, whilst we're on that discussion, going to use 7 stitches per inch, 3.85mm irons. The reason being is the distance between the holes seems to have hit an absolute sweet spot. That even if your stitching is not wholly on point, if your tension's good, the distance between the holes naturally begins to pull the thread at an angle. This is what we want to see. As we come down to 8, 9, 10 SPI, these holes get closer together. Your ability to stitch has to be much higher to govern the stitch to achieve it. Otherwise it will look flat or will have too much hole at the top of the stitching. 7 is an absolute sweet spot. So if you are looking for tools, 4mm stitch line and 7 SPI irons, or 3.85mm. That is your absolute sweet spot. It's not to say that they are beginner numbers or beginner tools, because you can go for the next 30 years only ever using a 4mm stitch line and 7 SPI and everything will look good. So it's a mainstay, it's an absolute mainstay. So our stitch line is going to be 4mm. Our SPI is going to be 7 or 3.85 mil. So the first thing that happens is evidently our stitch line. This sits at 4mm. What happens on the left happens on the right. Exactly the same again. 4mm. Now our stitching doesn't sit on our stitch line. It sits either side of our stitch line. So if this were our 4mm stitch line and we use nice irons for this, what we find is our stitching actually straddles that line. And our stitching sits up to 1mm either side, depending on which irons you have. I'm going to be using irons with a 1.8mm tooth. The tooth is set at 45 degrees, so the chances are this is going to be much closer to 0.7. But if you go for something like the Cinnabrooks, which are 2.2, then the distance between the stitching and the stitch line is up to 1mm. So we have our stitch line and our stitching, because if we don't accommodate this, then this gap between our stitching gets 2mm smaller the minute we stitch it. So we have to factor that in early. So as a result, we have a +1. We never round that up and call it 5, because we may come to this template in 6 months to remake it. We see 5, we set our stitch line at 5, we've closed this gap, it's got smaller. So it's always 4 + 1, and we've done it in reverse there, because our stitching encroaches into the piece. The stitching that encroaches towards the edge doesn't matter, nothing's going there. We know we have a constant, and that's the card. We have the width of the card, we know that's 86. So we'll pop that right in the middle. The next thing that we want to accommodate is how many cards are we going to have? 1, 2, 3, 4. It's your choice. But this is where your numbers will now vary from mine. I'm going to have 2 cards. So I know that equals 2mm. So I'm going to add 2mm here and 2mm here for my thickness. Because when my leather, if we look at it from the very, very end, our leather will travel along. So there's our stitch line, there's our stitching. Then the leather will rise up, go across the top of the cards, come down and go flat again. This is how the journey of the leather looks. So we have to accommodate it here. That's what our 2 is, here and here. That's here and here. If we add these numbers up together, it's going to be too tight to be functional. It's not fit for purpose. You are fighting it every time you're using it, and you won't use it. So we have to give a little bit of wiggle room to be able to take the card out and put it back in again. And 2mm at either side is more than enough. So this now is our wiggle room. All of these numbers represent what happens on the journey of our leather. So now what we want to do is add all of those numbers up. So 4 + 1 + 2 + 2 we know is 9. This is also 9. 9 and 9 is 18, plus 86 is 104. And we'll draw a circle around that because that's an important number. We've got lots of numbers on here, but we want to look at our job sheet and be able to see our figures correctly. This has dictated the width of our card holder. The next thing that we want to do is calculate the journey from top to bottom. So we're going to do a linear measurement exactly the same again, but this time it's vertical. This is now the aspect that we're looking at. We can see the journey of our leather, and there's a lot more happening here. The first thing, so if I bring this down slightly so we can see these numbers here, the first thing is we can see what happens here also happens here. So we can see we've got a 4mm stitch line. Then we've got our +1 because our stitching sits at an angle. The next thing that happens is the thickness of our card. Wiggle room happens here, but do we need wiggle room at the bottom? The truth of the matter is no, we don't, because we are expecting our card to sit as low as possible. If we add 2mm wiggle room, we are either expecting our card to hover 2mm above the stitching, or it's going to be a little bit too tall in the body up here. So we don't need the wiggle room. The next thing that happens is the card itself, 54. And what we can do is add those up. That gives us 61. So we can write 61 on this side. That 61 is the measurement from the bottom of the card holder to the top of the card. If we have our piece of leather set to 61, we won't see the card. It'll be sat behind the pocket. This will make it difficult to get out. So we have two options now. One, we put a scallop into our leather, exposing a part of the card for us to pinch and draw out. Or we shorten this piece of leather, exposing a pinch of the card to be able to draw the card out. And that's exactly what this measurement is called. It's called the pinch, because when we go to pinch the card, that's the action that we're undertaking. So that is called the pinch. In this instance, 10mm of exposed card is enough to make this functional. So what we can do below the 61 is minus 10, which is our pinch. That equals 51. That's the height of our pocket. So from here to the top of the leather for our pocket is 51mm. We now want a piece of leather behind the card. This is called the lip. As above, so below. So we've removed 10mm to expose 10mm of the card. The symmetry of 10, 10 is quite nice. So we are going to add 10mm for the body of our card holder. So above the 61, we are going to plus 10. That equals 71. And we will draw a circle around that. From the bottom of the card holder to the top of the card holder is 71mm. Bottom to the pocket is 51, and the top of the card itself sits at 61. So all of a sudden, we have the width and the height of both our pocket and our body. Everything is the same width. What we can do now is a parts list. We could say pocket times 2, body times 2. We're not going to do that. The reason I'm calling this body is the body of an item is anything that carries everything else. So if we were looking at a bag, the back of the bag would contain the back, the bend and the flap. But everything else attaches to that, so we would call that the body. Here, everything attaches to this piece, so we call this the body. There are 2 pockets, there are 2 bodies. They all get stitched together like so. So I've written them individually. We can look, starting with the width, because when we're doing measurements, if you're a map reader, you've always got to go along the corridor before you can go up the stairs. So we always do the width before the height. So If we do the width first, we know from our measurements above that the width of this is 104. This is our pocket, that's our short number, that's times 51. Back pocket is exactly the same, 104 times 51. Front body, same width, 104 times 71. Now the high number. Back body, 104 times 71. In writing these numbers out, we are looking for a common denominator, and we have it very clearly here, 104. This is telling us that when we come to cutting our leather, we can comfortably cut a strip of leather at 104 millimeters, which means all four pieces will be exactly the same width. This means trimming after with a knife becomes less necessary. This is a far more accurate way of cutting consistently. We can go a step further. We can add these numbers up. So we've got 71 plus 51 times 2. Add all these together, that is 244 millimeters. To make this card holder, we need one piece of leather, 104 millimeters wide by 244 millimeters long, and we can get all four pieces out of it for this. So this makes it a nice way of you being able to find out if you have enough leather to make this item. With our numbers, we are now ready to go and get a piece of card in preparation for making our templates. We only need 2 templates because we can use the same template for both pieces. One template, 2 pockets, one template, 2 bodies. Just a quick note, all the tools that you see me use, materials, are in a list on both armitageleather.com under supplies and secretsfromtheworkshop.com supplies. You will see a list of known, trusted and well-loved suppliers, and you will also, if you scroll down a little bit, find a PDF called Beginner's Tool List. All the tools that you see me use are on there. What I will say is I update that list quite frequently, but the people that run the websites that I link to update quicker than that. So 9 times out of 10, not 9 times, but certainly on some links you click and it doesn't take you to that item. You are on the right website, you just need to tab back on the URL and search for the item that you're looking for if that happens. I do try and sit down and update it, but honestly they just keep on messing about with it constantly. So I might, rather than do that, link to the website and then show you what to search for. But the short version is you will find everything that I use on either website, Secrets or Armitage, both under supplies. Card. So here I have a piece of 1,500 grams or 1.5 millimeter thick card, also known as mat board. The first thing that we are going to do with a piece of card, especially in this workshop, because I'm not entirely sure who cut this last, is we are going to put a common edge on our card. This is an edge we can trust. It's also the edge that we want to take as many measurements from as possible. When we're template making, cutting leather, we try and take as many measurements from as few places as possible. So what we're going to do here is put a little C there. That's our common edge. What we're going to do now is turn our card around so our common edge faces us. We're going to get our rule stop. We know the width of this item is 104 millimeters. So I'm going to set my rule stop to 104 millimeters. Like so. I'm then going to bring it to the edge of the board I'm going to measure in from that common edge that we've just drawn, an edge we can trust. I'm going to mark at least 3 times. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, I'm not doing that, I'm just going to do it. Trust me when I say, if you don't make a template, you are failing to plan. So therefore you have planned to fail. I will just leave that with you. You make up your own mind and then come back to me when you've made a few mistakes. This piece of card is 104 millimeters. But the question is, can we trust it? A very, very simplistic way of ensuring if we can trust our template is doing this. We know this is 104 millimeters wide. So if we set our rule stop to 52 millimeters, that's half the width of the card. We are going to create a center line. But I'm going to find a center line by marking one side of the card and then marking exactly the same place on the opposite side. I'm then going to have a look to see if my 2 lines meet up. They don't. So this is not set to the center of this end of the card. If I hold it back over and I can see one line, which I can, that means the rule is too long. If I held it over and I could see 2 lines, that means the rule is too short. So I need to shorten it by a little. And I can see I've got a little bit of a gap there actually between the 52 and the rule stop. So I'm just going to close that gap. I'm going to rub that out. And I'm going to do exactly the same again. Mark the center from one side, turn it around and mark the center from the opposite side. There I have one line. All I have established is that this rule and rule stop is centered to this end of the card. What I am not going to do is start moving down and assume that it's parallel. I don't know if it's parallel. So what I'm going to do now is use this as it is and come to the other end of the card and do exactly the same thing. If in drawing 2 lines I have one, I can trust that my card is parallel. If I have 2 marks, it is not parallel and I would need to start again. I can see clearly I've drawn 4 lines, but I can only see 2. This is set to this end perfectly. This end matches this end perfectly. That means these 2 lines are perfectly parallel. Of all the lines you ever draw, your center line is the most critical. So spend all of your time getting it right. In this instance, the only thing it's going to give us is our start point for our stitching. Elsewhere, it would be where holes are, where furniture sits, hardware. Your center line is critical. There's no square. There is just 2 parallel cuts. It's at this point, because the amount of people, when I say give me something, and they'll go, right, well, I'll find a square and I'll work from that square corner, and it doesn't work. It's inconsistent. This is the most consistent way to ensure you have both parallel and a right angle. So what I'm doing here, I can trust both of these. My center line tells me I can. I could put my rule up against the edge of the card and I can bring a square into play. Holding the card and the rule together, put the square up against the rule, and wherever I slide that, that will give me a perfect right angle. Slide the rule out of the way, and at which point now I can cut. That is a perfect right angle, but it looks very similar to this. We can get diverted, come back and forget which side we're working to. So a very simplistic way of ensuring we don't get it wrong is we can just nibble off the corner from the wrong end. Even if we turn it over, we can still see which is the wrong end. Now, making a template my way, because you're following, if you follow this properly, you're using my pre-pricking style of making holes. This is intentional. We end up with the holes crossing. That's on purpose. If you don't understand why, there are 4 very comprehensive videos on this channel that you can go and have a look at. And if you haven't already, go and look, because they will improve your stitching. I've developed this over the last 10 years with the onset of the new modern irons that have come out, because in the used to be, before this tool revolution, we had to use pricking irons and an awl. And that's great if you're a professional leather worker that constantly practice that skill set. But if you're not, and you're not adept with an awl, your stitching will always let you down. I can have somebody walk in here and by lunchtime have them stitching like you're about to see. It is a very effective way to achieve incredibly quickly. And this is designed to meet that style of stitching. So the template is being made to suit the modern style of stitching, my pre-pricking technique. Because we're using that style of stitching, the numbers that we start with may not end up being the numbers that we end with, because we do not try and force our stitching into a position where it doesn't fit. We will end up with either a long or a short stitch, or inconsistent stitches at the top end. These can be failure points. I'll highlight that in a little bit more detail when we get to the hole at the top of the pocket. So we adhere our numbers to our stitching. Now, bearing in mind we're using 7 SPI 3.85mm, no more than 4mm. If the hole is not in the correct position, it is no more than 2mm out in any position. So if we have to increase our pocket by 2mm, it will still work and look good. If we had to decrease the size of our pocket by 2mm, it will still work and it will look good. So 53 or 49 are very acceptable tolerances. We know if we can get it bob on, we're going to be really happy, but we also know we've got a huge amount of tolerance at play here as well. So we will always, because ultimately we want the item to look good, adhere to our stitching. Because especially with something like this, red leather, white stitching, if you were to throw in a long or a short stitch, it would scream at you. Even just having the back stitches at the top, they are more prominent and more obvious. So you can only imagine what a long or short stitch would appear like. It would scream at you. It would look terrible. So this is how we're going to get rid of that. We are going to set our rule stop to 51mm, which is the height of our pocket. We do this because the vast majority of items that we build that are layered, so we can have a pocket and a secondary pocket and a back, or we can have the front of the bag, our gusset and our back. The vast majority of information that we use to create our bag, pouch, pocket, card holder is taken from the front piece. So we work on the front piece first. So I've set my rule stop to the height of the pocket, 51mm, and I'm going to draw a line. But what I'm not going to do is cut it. Take this to the edge of the board. Don't do it like I'm doing it. I'm doing this because it's on camera and it's more visible. I'm going to draw a line at 51mm on both the left and the right. Not 3. I don't need to do 3. The reason being, is because I have that lovely common edge, which means I can bring the rule back into play. I can bring the square back into play, and this is my third measurement. So if I've got this right, all three lines, well, both lines and the square should touch. So now I can lightly draw that in. That line touches both of my measurements. That's my third point of reference. That means that is perfectly set at 51mm from the bottom of the card. I don't want to cut it. If it's short by 1mm, then I have to take 3mm off to make it fit. I'd rather not do that. If it's short by 1mm, I only have to add 1mm to make it fit. I would rather do that. If I cut it, the only thing that I can do is shorten it. I would far rather leave it attached, find out if it fits, find out where the variation is, and make that decision then, not early. So I'm just going to draw that in and leave it there for now. I want to stitch mark this, but I want round corners on my card holder. Tight corners look nice, they do work, but they are prone to damage. Going in and out of the pocket, the leather's going to collapse, it's going to separate, it's going to fail, and it's going to look tatty very, very quickly. In taking the corner off, we actually make the item more durable because there's a greater area at the corner, so it will be stronger and more durable in being put into an item, into a pocket, dropped, all sorts of bits and pieces. So a tight corner does work, does look good, but is more susceptible to damage. But what curve can I actually put on this? Because that is where a lot of this can go wrong. It's all about concentric circles. So at the moment, I have a corner. This is my corner. My card sits in from this, certainly at the bottom, by 7mm. So I would have a second line, and the distance from this line to this line is 7. The distance from this line to this line is 7. So the distance from this line to this line also wants to be 7 when I begin to add a curve. So we can take our card and we can pop it in here. And what we're doing is looking for the transition point where the curve goes into the straight. And we can measure that. We can pop that on there and we can say that is 4mm. So that 4mm, if we were to draw a circle and we mark the radius, that 4mm is from this radius to the edge. So this is 4mm. So if we were to measure the diameter of the full circle, it would be an 8mm circle to make it. We know that we want 7mm on all edges. So we want to draw another circle, and we know we want 7 here and 7 here, which means we've got to have 7 on this side and 7 above. So we are adding 14 to our 8mm circle. This gives us a diameter of 22 for our large circle. So from the radius, it's 11. This is an 8mm disc used to create that curve. This wants to be a 22mm disc to create the curve to ensure this 7mm travels all the way around consistently. If we make this bigger, this curve begins to encroach too close to this. Our stitching comes in it doesn't sit close enough because we don't have the space. Our card will sit higher. So 22 is the absolute maximum we can go to ensure this fits. 8 is the absolute minimum we can go to. We can have them both the same because we can't see them. If they were both visible, we would absolutely want concentric circles. But the truth is, if we went for an 8mm, 10mm corner, it's doing the same job the same way. It's not visibly recognisable because the card's inside the leather. It will still look good. So our minimum is 10. Our max is 22. We can function anywhere between those two numbers to get an effective corner. So if you get yourself a 20mm disc, you can cut your corner. I have a corner cutter set to 21mm. This is well within my 10 to 22, so I'm going to use this. What I'm going to do now, because placement is important, is 22 is what we're working to. The radius of that is 11. I'm going to set my rule stop to 11mm. Then I'm going to draw what we're going to call a way line on the corner, 11mm in from the edge of the card. This way line does two jobs for us. The first job is it helps us accurately cut our corners centrally. Once that's done, it's going to assist with us stitch marking, because this line is the transition point from the straight into the curve, which means we can use a long iron on the straight, but anything between these two marks is a curve. We have to defer to a two-tooth, otherwise our holes will be in the wrong position. So what I'm going to do is set my card so I have an apex facing away from me. This means I can put my corner cutter onto that corner and I can settle it between those two lines. I also want a little bit of space between the edge of the tool and the card. So I can then push and cut my corner off with a level of accuracy. Exactly the same for the opposite corner from the inside. Line it up between those two lines. Make sure there's a hair of a gap between the tool and the card, and we are there, like so. It may look good, we may be happy with it, but our eyes will tell us one thing, our fingers will tell us something else. And what we tend to find, especially when we leave a little bit of a gap, is we can end up with a little bit of an edge. So what we can do is just take a sponge until that edge goes, and that's as much effort as we need to put in to get in that corner absolutely bob on. And we can do exactly the same to the opposite one. Needs very little work, and we end up with two beautiful corners, because we are going to run a tool around those corners, and if we have a little bit of an angle, that will transfer through. So with our edges beautifully cut and smooth, we can now run a stitch line around our card. A set of dividers will do this. I have been leaning towards these crimson hide stitch markers heavily because I really like the fact that every time you pick up the 4mm, it is only ever 4mm. So I'm going to use that to run my line to line, and then I'm going to go around my corner, turning the card, turning the tool, keeping it perpendicular, line to line, and then exactly the same, the opposite corner, and then all the way down. So this is my pocket with my way lines, my centre line and my stitch line. What I'm going to do is start my holes bottom centre. The idea is if I work out and up, then both top horizontal holes are in line. One of the worst things that we can do is start at one edge, come all the way down, go around, and this one's 2 or 3 millimeters out. It just looks awful. So this is how we avoid that. We avoid it by starting bottom centre first. So I'm going to take my 2-tooth and I'm going to straddle both the centre line and the horizontal vertical line, and I'm going to start making my mark a little deeper the happier I get, and there we go. That has given me 3 holes bottom centre, but my centre hole is perfectly cutting the centre line and the horizontal stitch line, which means that hole is right in the middle. I can now take a long iron and work out towards the right hand way line. This is a test end, I've cut the other end. And what I've done to achieve that is I've put the iron into the last hole with the first tooth, tapped it, put the first tooth in the next hole and turned it, tapped it, put the first tooth into the next hole, turned it and tapped it, and that's distorted these holes. So what I want to do is put the first tooth into the last hole and lightly mark in the correct position on my card. Then I can lift it and move it and do the next hole. Then I can lift it, move it, do the next hole, lift, move and do the first hole of the vertical straight. What I can do now, because this hole is very similar to this hole, that means I can strike these two as a pair and these two as a pair. This will give me a much smarter looking corner. This will prevent me from damaging my card and ultimately damaging my leather. So now, with my first hole dictated by my 2-tooth in my vertical straight, I can come back to the long iron. We can go over the way lines with a 2-tooth into the straight, but we can't go over the way lines with a straight iron into the curve. Give that a kiss and then move up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over very, very slightly. And we can see here that that tooth sits on that line perfectly. So we do not need to adjust. If there were perhaps a millimetre gap, we would consider extending that. Because the alternative, if I do the next hole, would be coming down under this hole here. And we can see we're losing the best part of 3 millimeters. So here it would be better to extend it a millimetre than reduce it 3 millimeters, path of least resistance. As it happens in this instance, that sits over there perfectly because we want as much leather between the edge of the leather and that top hole as possible, because this is where it's going to get attached to the body. That's going to be under the maximum amount of stress. So if that hole is too close to the top of the leather, then that's weaker. Or if we cut through it, that's a failure point that's just going to tear over time. We want this top hole here to be identical to this top hole here. There's a very simplistic way of doing this. We can bring our rule and our square back into play. We can turn our template around because we have a template we can trust. We can take our irons and put it back into these holes on the opposite side here. We can then bring our square, holding our card against our rule, slide that up against our tool. The square touches the top tooth of the iron. We can lift that out, keeping the square in the same position, and move it over to the opposite side. Then we can give that a tap. This ensures that our top two holes are perfectly horizontal, like so. Then we can turn our card around and begin to work back down toward the corner. We are human. There is the possibility that there will be an element of variation. So that's the last hole of the straight made on the outside of this curve. We can come back to our two tooth now. We can walk down, very lightly mark. We can turn it around and we can now walk towards our next. And what we're looking for. These two have been made by coming from the bottom edge. This one has been made by coming from the top. We want to see if these two fit together. And they do, beautifully. This means we can treat this one exactly the same as we did with the other. We can have this as a pair. And we can treat these two as a pair as well. So if I come over that line with a two tooth, and that's exactly how we mark the opposite side. Now, if I come and mark these two, we mark those as a pair. We can see, whilst the angle is different, it fits, and that fits. We are happy with that. So when we look at the bottom of both corners, they have been made exactly the same. What we're going to do now is a hole count. If I add those up, that gives me 46. With this one, 47. And I can draw a circle around it. That's not wholly necessary for us to do on a simple little card holder, but that's good practice because that's exactly how we would calculate a gusset if we were making a bag, because we would make our gusset big enough to get 47 holes in, and at which point all of a sudden we've taken our little card holder into a card holding wallet with a gusset. We are happy we've got a good measurement. That line works an absolute dream. 51 looks good, which means we can pop our square up against that line, and I'll just mark those two little holes because they're easier to see than the line is, and I'm now going to cut, and that's our pocket for our card holder. Funny story, I've already filmed this bit, but the camera ran out of film, so I'm going to do it again. Rather than skip over it and you miss out on important information. So where we were at, we have just completed our pocket. We now want to work on our body. Ignore this, can't take it off until the tattoo removal has taken effect. So we have the same size piece of card, same centre line, all the information we use on our pocket we're going to use on our body. Exactly as we did before, we're going to set our rule stop to 11. This is for our way lines and for cutting our corner. Now, I did skirt across this a little too quick in the last video, and this has given me an opportunity to perhaps do it in a little bit more detail. So if you watched the pocket making video, and in particular the holes at the bottom, I think I went across that a little too quick or forgot to press record for an important piece. This is our opportunity to cover it again. So we've got our 104 width and our 11mm way lines. We can, as we have done before, take our corner cutter and again have it on the apex between those two lines, making sure we've got a hair of a gap between the edge of the tool and the card, and cut our corner off. Do exactly the same on the opposite side. Now in this instance we can do all four corners because the truth is we can actually cut this to size to 71mm. The chances of this changing size is incredibly unlikely, so we don't need to worry about any adjustment on our body piece. We can therefore again take this to the edge of the board, mark our top right and our top left. They are our two lines. We can bring our rule and our square to our card and we can cut that off, making sure those two lines hit the edge of the square. They do, so I have 3 points of reference to confirm that's a good right angle. I can then add my way lines to the top corners. We're adding the way lines to the top corners because firstly we want to round those top corners, and secondly the horizontal way line is the transition point above which we do not want to stitch, because if we did, then we're encroaching into the opening of the card holder, and as a result we're making the mouth smaller. So our stitching wants to stop on or below that way line. And exactly the same again, popping the tool onto our card, making sure there's a gap, and cut our top corners off. We may be happy with the look, but again, there is absolutely nothing wrong with just cleaning up any high points on these corners where the tool may not get it. Run your finger around it. The eyes are telling us it looks good, but the fingers will really tell us if it's smooth. So that's our 71mm piece. We want to define if we're in the right position, so we're going to go back to our pocket template and reset our rule to that, which, looking at the rule, looking at the template, that's given me 51. So exactly the same again, take it to the edge of the bench and we're going to mark left and right. We can then bring our square back into play because we're all about right angles and square edges. Pop that on there. Do they both line up? Yes, they do, beautifully, and we can lightly draw that line in. That line represents where the pocket will sit at the top. So now I have a piece of card that matches my pocket. All I want to do now is add my holes to my card. Now this isn't wholly necessary because the way that we're going to deal with our two pieces of leather is to glue this piece to this piece and then make our holes through here. So we can say that's done. But this is a golden opportunity for us to practice. So we're going to take it, because if we are watching this video, we're learning. If we are making card holders and they're not as good as we would like, then perhaps practice is a really good idea. So why sacrifice an opportunity to practice when it arises? So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're not going to hold our template over the top of the other and mark through, because we're not learning anything from that. We're not developing our skill set. we're going to mark it completely independently, because if we can do that and achieve on a piece of card that costs pennies, but the technique and the learning opportunity is invaluable. But if we don't do that and then go to our leather that's expensive and we make a mistake, that's incredibly frustrating and costly. So every opportunity with template making that we can take to learn and practice, we will seize. So as a result, we're going to put that to one side and we're going to start again. Taking my 4mm stitch line, starting at that line, down straight between the two lines. Then we're going to go around the corner, turning both the stitch marker and the card. This is the lovely thing about these crimson hides. I've not had to adjust it, so I'm not picking up, because I might have made my stitch line here at 4.2mm and I might have readjusted it and it's actually 3.8, but they both look like 4. This is putting my stitching out slightly. This is not allowing that to happen. And I find I rarely today pick up the dividers now I've got these in the workshop, because it's about trust. If I can trust the tool, if I can trust the technique, if I can trust the template, I know I'm moving forward well. So this is the bit that I feel I skirted over a little too quickly in the pocket template. Exactly the same as I did before, I want to start my stitching middle at the bottom, centre bottom, and work out and up on both sides. This is the best opportunity for me to get these two top holes horizontal. So I'm going to start off with a 2-tooth, bisecting both the vertical centre line and the horizontal stitch line. I'm going to wander around because they look different upside down. And as soon as I'm happy, I'm going to press firm. Take as much time over this as you want to. The more time you take, the more accurate you are, the better this will be. And I can see there that I've bisected both the centre line and the stitch line with that middle tooth. I'm happy with that. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take the long iron, and to reiterate, I can stop short of this way line, I can land on the way line, but I cannot go over the way line with a long iron because the line begins to rise. I would have to go to a 2-tooth. So any straight edge, which is anywhere between these two lines here or these two lines here, we can use the long iron. Anything between these two way lines on the curve, we would use a 2-tooth. So I'm going to pop it in, grab my maul so I can give it a tap, and I'm going to work out towards that first way line. What I'm doing is trying to straddle the line. I don't want to put the iron on the line, because if I do, once I stitch, I will see the line. If I straddle the line, once I stitch, I won't see the line. I appreciate we are not stitching card here, but if we do mark the leather the same way, the same principle stands. Straddle the line so it's hidden behind the stitching. I only need one more hole to get just shy of the line. If I have two more, that's going well into the corner, and that will put that tooth too low down. It actually wants to be a little higher. So I can stop short of the way line, but I cannot go over it with this 2. I need to swap over to the 2-tooth to go over that line. So I'm happy with that. What I'm going to do now is work the other way. So I'm going to turn it around. This is all about leading and dragging with our irons. And again, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here because this video will end up being 6 hours long, but it's covered in finite detail on the channel, Secrets from the Workshop. Go and have a look. It's an invaluable resource and collection of videos covering all of this. Again, one more tooth. What I'm looking for here is the relationship between the edge of this hole and this way line being the same as the relationship between the edge of this hole and this way line, and I'm happy with that. There is always the possibility of variation, and this is where we can lose it on the opposite corner if needs must. So now I'm going to pick the 2-tooth up. Having talked about going around our corners sympathetically, I'm going to lean in and lightly mark. I am not making the holes as I go, because if I do, I will damage the card. Or if it's leather, I will damage the leather. Now I have very, very lightly marked that card. I'm going to treat these two as a pair. I'm going to treat these two as a pair. And I can come back, position over those marks and commit. Turn it. Exactly the same here. So we're smoothly around this corner because we've used a 2-tooth to go over this horizontal line. We can come back to our long iron and we can now work our way up towards the top. We can give that a tap. Now we want to see where this hole above this line sits. So if we pop it in and lean it over, we can see that this tooth, this end one on the far right, is sitting perfectly on that line, and we are very happy with that. But we also know we've got enough space to perhaps have 2 or 3. Now if we do 3, then it sits just on that way line, like so. It's very, very slightly high of the line, but the stitch is going to sit below, so we're going to get away with that. It's not going to encroach into. We can have 2, but we'll go for 3. Symmetry is one of the most important things we want to try and achieve when we're making something. We want to produce symmetry with our top 2 holes. Now, we've got a line there. We could probably use that line to seat our tool comfortably. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop, in fact, if I turn this round, it might be a little easier for me. I'm going to pop the template up against the square edge. I'm going to put the tool back into the holes that I've just made. I'm going to bring the square back into play. This is going to give me a lovely right angle. So everything is square off, and I can lift the tool and move it over to the other line. What I'm looking for here is the right hand tooth sitting against the square, and also the top tooth on the left sitting the same as it does on this side. And as I lift it up, we can see that's happened. That means these top 2 holes are perfectly horizontal. We can also see this hole sits perfectly on the line, as does this one. So these are horizontal. Everything about viewing this is going to be about viewing symmetry, and symmetry is pleasing to see. So when we introduce asymmetry, that things look odd. We may not know why we don't like what we're looking at, but we know we don't like it. And now I'm going to work down to that bottom horizontal way line. Again, I can't go over it because I'm using the long iron, so I'm going to stop short. So we can see the relationship, or the distance, between this bottom hole and this line is the same as it is here. So we're happy with that. We can now begin to work around our corner. Now the temptation is we start here, we work round, we go up. We start here, we work round, we go up. If we're really good at stitch marking, we may be fine. But we do introduce errors. So this is a nice way of removing any possibility of any error that we introduce. So early days, while we're still getting our practice in, this is a nice idea. Taking this across, because these 2 are the most important holes visually, then these 2, and then the centre hole. But once the centre hole stitched, we'd never see it. There's no line down the leather for us to follow, so we wouldn't know if it was centred or not. So this is how we can make sure, if we do have variation, how we can deal with it. Exactly as we've done on our other corner, we're going to start working in from the horizontal line. I'm going to mark both holes very, very lightly. So they're there, but they're very light, they're not made. I'm then going to mark from the vertical line down. What I'm looking for here is, do these two holes match? In this instance, they do. Let's say we end up with an extra millimetre. This gap is now 4.85 instead of 3.85. If we were to stitch that, we'd have a huge stitch. That would be really obvious. This is what we can do. This mark down is 3.85. This mark in is 3.85. This gap is 4.85. But if we split the difference here by putting these two holes together as one, we take that millimetre and halve it, and we put half in this stitch and half in this stitch. That reduces the visible variation that we've introduced. I don't have to do that because it's worked out well. But if we do come across that situation, that's what we can do. So I'm going to pop down, treat those two as a pair, exactly like I did on the other, and then I'm going to treat these two as a pair. So angle it, place it, and commit. And now my bottom holes on my template, left and right, match. If I take now my pocket template, equally they match beautifully. So I would like to use the information from these holes through to my leather. So what I'm going to do is open these holes up a smoosh. This gives me the ability to then mark through the card without fighting the card to mark the leather beneath it. This will give me more accuracy. So I am just spending a bit of time opening these holes up like so. So that's all the holes opened up. I'm going to give this a try. And there we go. We can see all of our holes line up. That's 2 bits of card. But the interesting thing is we're going to have 2 more of these identical, and when they get stitched together, they're going the opposite way round. The question is, can we still see through them? And the answer is, yes we can, absolutely. That means we have perfect symmetry. It's only pinpricks because the holes cross. So we can only see where the holes meet, which is a tiny little pinprick. This is telling us we have absolute accuracy. We're going to do what we did before. So we're going to count. This is going to be a slightly different number, so we're not going to count the 3 above it. So I now have, including the middle one, 53. 6 away gives us 47. If we were to separate our 2 pieces with a gusset, like so, that's exactly what we would make. Think of that as a little bag. So yes, we are making a card holder, but this is a prelude to so much more. If bag making is on your horizon, this is a very small, achievable mini bag, because the techniques that you would apply to this are identical. Yes, we're looking at a little bit more mathematics when it comes to calculating the bend of the leather that goes over the top. We're looking at calculating the length of the flap and a bunch of other things. But ultimately, this process for bag making is the same as this process for making the card holder template. It's identical. You have already learned your first stage of bag making here. Or if you were to perhaps look at a wallet with one pocket, you repeat this here, this becomes a fold over wallet. That's on the channel as well. If we look at a simple bifold wallet, here we've got two pockets. So the plate, the body, becomes the large pocket. The front pocket, albeit has a scallop, is still evident. Instead of stitching these two together back to back, we stitch them to a larger piece of leather. It becomes a wallet. You see how these things develop. We can dismiss this out of hand as it's a card holder, I want to make a bag. Your skill set for bag making, for all other things, lives here. Do not understate it. Not just that. If you're going to generate revenue for your hobby by going to craft fairs or Renaissance fairs or things like that, these are fantastic achievable things to generate revenue, to pay for the materials, to pay for the tools, to pay for lessons, to pay for subscriptions to Secrets from the Workshop. Don't forget that one. And you can knock these up, because a proper lesson here in the workshop to do a card holder is 2 days, because we go into absolute detail about template making. You come away at the end of 2 days with a card holder, but your knowledge base is immense. It's absolutely huge. We look at suitability of leather, we look at different types of tools, we look at sharpening the tools, we look at applications of the tools and how each stage can be adjusted to different items. So the topic is huge. So the first day we would spend, first day and a bit, we would spend on the template. Most of the second day we would look at the leather. But let's break that down. At home, on your own, you could spend 8 hours making this, okay? But to be fair, 5 hours of that is spent on the template. Well, tomorrow you're not spending 5 hours on the template, you're spending 3 hours on the leather because you already have the template. But truth be told, because you have a very clear understanding of what you're doing, you could probably whittle that down to 2 hours, which means now in an 8-hour period of time you could make 4 of these. Well, the truth is, if you cut a massive strip of leather, you've probably got 5 there. So we're processing, we're batching our tasks. And we could perhaps make 7 in a day. So if you are looking at something for sale at a fair or the like, people love these. They're affordable, they're achievable for you, and they are really, really popular. Nobody carries too much cash, everyone has a card holder, make it in different leather, and you've got yourself a winner all day long. So that's the end of the template making section of this build. In the next section, we're going to be looking at leather selection, introducing some techniques you may not have considered, skiving, that's a huge thing, and stitching. Hopefully you've seen the videos on stitching. If not, definitely worth a look, because that is your bread and butter. Everything that you're going to make is going to get stitched. If your stitching looks naff, awful, hideous, nobody's going to want it. They're going to look at it and go, some 4-year-olds had a bash at that, and then they've chewed it. And, you know, we could be really proud and go, oh yes, that's handmade. But you'd not put any effort into the stitching. Your stitching will sell an item. You can have an item that actually has misshaped pieces. But if you stitch it well, you'll get away with it. You could have perfectly cut pieces that fit together, but if your stitching's awful, you're not going to get away with it. Your stitching is a priority. It is not a task that is to be got out of the way. Oh, I'll stitch it together, I don't want to stitch. If stitching isn't fun, you're doing it wrong. Go and watch those videos. So, take a look at the next section where we transfer our attention from card to leather.